G'day, this is the New Zealand vlog. I spent 2 months in New Zealand. So flying out from Cairns, I flew into Christchurch. James stayed in Australia, he went to Sydney, and I heard the pies were good, so the first thing I bought when I got off the plane was a butter chicken pie, and I was staying in a hostel just before New Year's. And on New Year's Eve I just met up with some people that I met online. We went out for dinner and then we went to the park to see some live music and fireworks. On New Year's Day, I got a lift to a farm where I'd be working for a few weeks in return for accommodation and food. And this is my room, so I've got a couple of shelves and a sofa. So I started working on the farm and learned about the different tasks that need to be done to keep the farm ticking. But some of my jobs were more DIY for houses instead of farming. Out the log cabin today. Been just doing weeding around the trees that are going along the line. So after a long day of weeding, I spent the next day taking the day off. I took the ute, which is what the Kiwis call their pickup trucks. I took the ute to Rakaya Gorge, and I went for a walk along the gorge, which had crystal blue water. The next day back at work, we were mixing canary and millet seed and packing it, but as we were loading the pellet, the tractor broke down, so we spent the whole afternoon wiggling with the electrics of the tractor until it got fixed. Over the next few days, I was doing lots of little odd jobs. It was doing stuff with irrigators, making pins and pinning plastic covers down underneath houses, and digging trenches. It was a lot of lone working without much guidance, so after a week into the farm I decided that I'd be leaving the next week. On the Saturday I went out with some people that I'd met through the farm, and we went to Mount Sunday, which was the filming location for Edoras in Rohan in the Lord of the Rings. We walked up to the top and it was too windy to hear in this clip, but there was someone who actually took a violin there and was playing the theme from The Lord of the Rings for this area. On the Sunday I had planned to do a walk and I was driving to get to the car park, but as I was turning right to go into the car park, someone went to overtake me and we had a bit of a scratch up. Thankfully no one was hurt, but it was a bit of a shock. But a Swiss couple who were friends of the farm came through, so we went to see some cow milking and went to a viewpoint. The next few days I was doing odd jobs on the farm. One of them was trying to make steel drums that would fit onto the top of a septic tank. So I got to have a go using an angle grinder. And no, I didn't chop my fingers off. This was actually just from cooking, because the next day I made a big meal for people on the farm. And someone made a lovely dessert as well afterwards. On my last day on the farm, I was guiding people who were driving 2 telehandlers to put a veranda onto the side of the log house. And on the evening I got a lift back to Christchurch because there was an event on which was surfing for farmers, so we did some surfing before I stayed in Christchurch for a few days. Up at 7 this morning to get I think it's an 8-hour bus to get me to Milton, to a sheep farm today. So I travelled south by bus to just past Dunedin to a place called Milton, and I stayed there for 3 days doing a bit of work on a sheep farm. We were separating the ewes from the lambs to go to slaughter, and we also did some crutching, which is removing the dirty bit of the back of the wool before the shearing. And then on my last day the shearers were in, so I was packing the wool down into bales, and I got a lift back into Dunedin on the afternoon. On the first sunny day in Dunedin I went out with some people from the hostel that I'd met. We went to Tunnel Beach, where there were some cool rock formations. This was the view from outside my hostel. And the next afternoon I went out to do some rock climbing with people I met online, and we went out for dinner on the evening. The next day with the same people and some people I'd met in the hostel, we went out on a day trip to the peninsula, and then we went down to Sandfly Beach where we got to see some seals. And we also saw a very rare yellow-eyed penguin, but we didn't get a picture of it. Then the next day someone from my hostel was also travelling through to Christchurch, so we shared a ride. And in Christchurch I was just chilling out at the hostel, playing a bit of basketball before James was coming. Going to a park run this morning in Christchurch. It starts at 8 instead of 9 in New Zealand for some reason, so a little bit earlier. But there's lots of cool street art around. So yeah, there was a lot of cool street art throughout Christchurch, and not in any particular places, just everywhere you went around the streets, different roads. Lots of cool artwork that you just see whilst walking around. So after a few days I met back up with my brother James, and we went out to an Ed Sheeran concert where Vance Joy was supporting him. And even though it was raining and a bit cold, he put on a good show. But unfortunately, towards the end, I got really cold and felt quite unwell, so I had to leave early. Then over the next few days, we were just sort of hanging out in Christchurch, watching a bit of Lord of the Rings, and making some nice food. We spent a few days just wandering around the city before we went off to pick up our camper van. So we were going to be living in this camper van for about 4 weeks, so we made sure that we checked everything out. It had a little fridge and a gas cooker and a sink to wash up in, and there was also 2 double beds that could be pulled out on the bottom and top. Picked up the camper van today, so been doing a lot of shopping at charity shops and got ourselves some supplies to keep us going, and we'll see what we get on. So we were going to be heading more inland towards the southern Alps around Lake Tekapo and Mount Cook, so we decided to split up our journey and we stopped off at Geraldine for our first night. So we stopped off and made some burgers for our dinner. Then for our first full day in the van, we headed towards Lake Tekapo and we went on a hike just around the side of the lake and we got some good views from high up. We stopped off for some lunch at the top, and then once we came down to the bottom of the track, we chilled out at the river before heading in for a swim. And this was going to be our second night in the van, and we were going to be staying at a free camp. But the thing is, with free camps, you don't get any showers, so this was our bath for the night. We had some dinner out at the back of the van, and then we drove to our campsite for the night. The next day, we stopped off at Lake Tekapo again for some breakfast, and we drove towards Mount Cook. We just stopped off at the pool at Twizzle to have a shower and a bit of a swim before we go to our campsite tonight. So yeah, we got a swim and a shower at the local pool and had our dinner outside our campsite. Having some breakfast this morning. We started off early so that we'd have enough time to get up to Muller Hut at the top. And it was quite a steep hike. There was about 1,000 metres of elevation to the top, and then we'd be coming back down it. So a couple of bits were a bit scrambly, but when we got towards the top it levelled off a lot more and we had some great views. It's quite alpine environment, so we walked over some of the snow and we managed to get towards the hut where we were going to stop for some lunch. So we got some pictures up at the top of Muller Hut and you could see Mount Cook here. After lunch we headed back down on a steep descent and treated ourselves for dinner with some lovely spag bol. So today we're just going to have a pretty chill day. Starting off with some breakfast, we'll probably do some laundry, maybe look for some sleeping bags, and just stay at a free campsite tonight. Yeah, pretty chilled. So we started the day off well with a 3-course breakfast, and we did some laundry and played a bit of chess before we headed to our campsite for the evening. Stopped for our dinner for tonight, pretty good. And then we had some cheese and crackers afterwards. The next day we were travelling from Twizzle towards Queenstown. We stopped off along the middle, and when we got to Queenstown we made some burgers and a barbecue for our dinner. Then for our first day in Queenstown I headed out on a Lord of the Rings tour. So we visited some of the different filming locations for Lord of the Rings. This one's from the second film where they're watching the army march through. The tour was really useful to find out lots of information, like how Peter Jackson, the director, got the New Zealand Army to stand in as the armies in the films. And Sean Bean was so afraid of helicopters that he'd hike up in all of his gear to get to the filming locations. We stopped off at Glenorchy to see one of the world's smallest libraries. Then we went to the filming location for Isengard, and this spot was private and it's been used in multiple films like Narnia and Wolverine. We then went to a filming location for Lothlorien in the first film, and there were some costumes, so we got to do a bit of dress up for some pictures.
It took the little ones. You shall not pass!
After this, James and I chilled out in Queenstown, and we kept on going back to the same ice cream place, Patagonia Ice Cream, because that was some really good ice cream. Then the next day we went to the Department of Conservation to ask them some questions, and I saw that there was a booking for the Routeburn track, which is very popular, and there were some free huts available, so we booked them and stocked up on our supplies to get ready. The next day we were driving from Queenstown to Tiarnu. It took us about 4 hours, and when we got there we went out for dinner. The next day we were getting a bus trip to get a ferry in Milford Sound. So on the way we stopped off in the Glacial Valley and checked out Mirror Lake, which is meant to have good reflections, and stopped off a few times along the valley. Then when we got to Milford Sound we got onto our ferry, where we had a tour through some of the glacial waters around Milford Sound. So the whole valley used to be filled with glaciers, but now there's just really deep channels of water and really steep cliff edges. It took quite a while to get to Milford Sound, and it was quite impressive. We saw some cool waterfalls as well as some seals, but it was probably a little bit of an overhyped tourist spot.
Rainy day in New Zealand. I think it's worse here than in the UK.
Right, we've just dropped our van off at the Divide. About to start a 3-day hike along the Routeburn track, staying at 2 different huts. So we set off on the Routeburn track, and usually it's done from the Routeburn shelter to the Divide, but we did it in reverse because that was the only bookings that we could get. The Routeburn track is one of the 11 Great Walks of New Zealand. This means the track is pretty well maintained, and there's usually good facilities in the huts as we headed along. But our first day whilst we were heading to Lake Mackenzie was a rainy day, which was probably a good day to have the rain on because we were mostly just in the forest and amongst the trees. But it did mean all of the waterfalls were looking good. We then headed through some more mossy woodland until we got to Lake Mackenzie hut. There were toilets, but there were no showers along the track, so once we got to Lake Mackenzie we decided to go in for a swim. Most of the water came from the snow on the top of the mountain, so it was pretty cold.
That was a lot colder than I anticipated.
After our swim, we warmed up inside the hut because there was a small fire, and we had some rehydrated meals that we heated up.
Freeze-dried mash. Bad. We've got freeze-dried stroganoff.
And after our meal, we had an hour-long hut talk from the hut warden, who told us lots of different stories about the New Zealand environment, and it was pretty much just a stand-up comedy that was well rehearsed.
And finally arrived in New Zealand after a very long voyage.
We were staying in our sleeping bags on foam mattresses inside of the huts. We set off for day 2, starting in the forest, and went up higher to get more into the mountains. We stopped off at about halfway at one of the smaller shelters just for some lunch, and we took about an hour detour to hike up Conical Hill. And we left our big bags down at the shelter that we're going back down to, which made it a lot easier to hike up and down. And thankfully this day was a lot clearer without any rain. Once we'd come down the hill, we picked our bags back up and set off along the track again. I think this was probably the best bit of the track. We had great weather, and we were next to a beautiful lake and some great mountains.
Not too shabby.
There There were lots of streams along the way that we could fill our water up from. It was fresh water straight off the mountain, and it was really good, fresh and cold. And at the end of that day's hike, we got to the Rootburn Falls hut. We sat outside of the hut and just had our dinner outside with a lovely view. And that evening, at the end of the hut talk, there was a quiz to try and identify as many languages as you could from these banners. And as the cultured Brits that we are, we managed to come last.
Wow.
On our final day of the Rootburn track, we headed down from Rootburn Falls hut, and we were heading down to the Rootburn shelter. And we paid a company to relocate our van for us so that we could park it on one side and then they would move it for us and it'd be ready on the other side when we got there. So it was mostly flat after we came down the mountain. We passed over a few swing bridges and had some snacks. And we got back to the van and then we drove to Queenstown and got ourselves a Ferg burger. After this we were going to be driving to Wanaka, and along the way I was trying to find one of the Lord of the Rings filming locations, but it wasn't very clear where it was. But we were able to stretch our legs a bit before we drove the rest of the way to Wanaka. This was a really nice drive as we got some good views as we went over the hills. We were pretty tired after the Rootburn track, so we spent the next day in Wanaka just chilling out, doing a bit of planning. We went for a swim in the lake, and the next day we just hung around Wanaka because it was such a nice day. And we went again out to go and get some more of the delicious ice cream. And then on the afternoon we drove from Wanaka towards Franz Josef. And the next morning, after watching a Sunderland game, we headed out for a helicopter ride to go up to the Franz Josef Glacier. And when we got to the top, we had a bit of time to take some videos and pictures. And then on the way back down, I got to have a go in the front. It was quite a quick helicopter ride. We were probably up and down in just about an hour. But it was the first time either of us had been in a helicopter, and we did get some great views on a clear day, so it was definitely worth it. Then on the afternoon, we just headed out to a beach to have some lunch and chill out on the beach and have a swim. It was quite a soft sandy beach, so we were a bit ambitious taking the van onto it. But it was very quiet, so we had the beach pretty much to ourselves. And on the evening we made ourselves some burgers. The next morning we started off with a good breakfast. This morning we're setting off on the Copland track to stay at the Welcome Flat hut for one night. And then we'll come back down the same route tomorrow. It's a pretty sunny day, but we're surrounded by trees. And our bags are a little bit lighter because we didn't have to take as much food. But we've got a lot of sandwiches to munch through to keep us going. So yeah, we set off on the 17k Copland track, and we were going to be staying just at one night at the hut at the top and then coming back down the next day. This wasn't one of the great walks of New Zealand, so the track wasn't as well as maintained, but this also meant that it wasn't as busy. We started off in the trees before walking along beside the river, and then we had to go across quite a few swing bridges, which was just one person at a time. And there were some streams along the way that we could top up our water from. Then, after being by the river for most of the walk, we went on a steep incline and a couple of swing bridges to get towards our hut that we were going to be staying at for the night. When we got to the hut, we dumped our stuff off and headed into the hot springs, where the water was heated from volcanic springs. The next day, we headed back down the same track, crossing over the bridges, and it was another lovely day, and we stopped off by the river to have some sandwiches. We had planned to do this walk a day earlier, but the weather wasn't good, so we managed to reschedule to do it with good weather on both days. Once we finished the track, we drove towards Hokitika, where we had a nice big pizza for dinner and got a nice sunset on the evening. The next day we were going to be driving to Nelson. It probably took us about 5 hours. It would always take a bit longer in the camper van than Google Maps suggested it would. And we'd split the long drive up, switching now and then, and our first stop off was breakfast at Punakaki. And on the evening we made it to Nelson to stay at a campsite, and we had some chili with some deer in the background. And along the west coast of New Zealand there's sandflies, so they've been giving us a lot of grief. The next day we were going to be travelling towards the Abel Tasman National Park. We stopped off at a beach along the way, and it was so nice that we had our breakfast and our lunch there. Then on the evening we got to our campsite and booked some boats to get into the Abel Tasman National Park the next day for a hike. So we got a boat to take us into the middle of the park. The walk we did was part of a multi-day hike. The section we were walking was the middle day, so we were only walking part of the track. The beaches here were lovely and the water was a beautiful blue, so we stopped off at a few of them along our way whilst we were walking, and we took some sandwiches and snacks to have for lunch. The trek was about 14k, but it was pretty flat, so it didn't take us too long, and we could spend the afternoon chilling out on the beach. And we even had a bit of energy left over to go for a swim and a run along the beach, before we were going to get picked up and taken back by another boat. And that evening we made ourselves a stir fry in the campsite. The next day we started off with a nutritious ice cream for breakfast, and we were driving about 3 or 4 hours towards Picton to get a ferry, so we stopped off along the way to have some lunch. So we drove to Picton, and then we got a ferry from Picton to Wellington on the North Island. The next day in Wellington I set off on another full day Lord of the Rings tour. We first visited the spot where the hobbits have to hide from the Nazgul in the first film, and then another spot where another shot was taken of the Black Rider. After this we went to the Weta Workshop in Wellington, where they showed some of the different props that they'd made throughout the films. Unfortunately you couldn't take any pictures inside, but I got a couple outside. Then we stopped where there were some of the river scenes, had some lunch, and then we went out to the place where they filmed Rivendell, and afterwards Isengard. This tour was okay, but I think I probably could have done a lot of the stuff myself compared to Queenstown, where the guide was really good. The next day I went back to some of the places that we didn't go to, which I didn't understand why, because we were right next to them on the tour anyway. And on the afternoon we drove north to Ohakune. The next day we took a chill day as we waited for the weather to get better before we started the Tongariro Alpine Crossing. We set off along the track probably a bit later than most of the people, and this mountain here was used to film Mount Doom in Lord of the Rings as well. We started off heading up, and we started to overtake a couple of people along the way, so we started to see it was a bit more busy. We stopped off for some lunch along the way, had some tuna salad, and the environment started to change quite quickly the higher up we got. This was a one-way hike, so we'd left our camper van on one site and got a shuttle bus that took us round to the other side to start the trek. This is one of the most popular walks in New Zealand, so it was quite busy on the track, but it was pretty accessible and there were lots of cool things to see. We stopped off at a lake for another snack and continued down the track that eventually went into the forest, and we were pretty tired by the end of this, but we went pretty quickly on the downward section. And when we got back to the van we realised we needed to recreate a scene from Four Lions. We stopped off in Taupo for the night, and the next day we travelled through to Auckland. Packing up the van this morning. We're going to be dropping it off today, so we put the beds away for the first time since we got them out pretty much, and yeah, sorting our stuff out, sorting our food out and travelling to Auckland. So we drove through to Auckland to spend 2 nights there. Early start this morning, going to get the bus to Hobbiton. So after about a 2.5 hour bus journey we made it to Hobbiton. This is where they filmed the Shire in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. In The Lord of the Rings it was all made out of plastic, so it had to be taken down afterwards. but for The Hobbit they decided to make it all out of real materials so it could be a tourist attraction. This is Bag End where Bilbo and Frodo end up living. And this is the party field, which usually isn't open, but we were quite lucky on that day. It was the first day it had been open. Next we got to have a look inside one of the hobbit holes, and this was built to size for a hobbit, so it was a bit small for humans to walk around in. There was a lot of detail on all of the furniture, and there was pantries and lots of different rooms to explore. After this we crossed over the lake and headed into the Green Dragon for a drink. And the tour finished off with a buffet lunch. After the tour and a lot of travelling, I was pretty tired, and when we got back to Auckland we decided to have another big meal before going out to play some basketball in the evening. The next day we packed up all our stuff, dropped the van off, got to the airport and set off on our next trip to South America.
So that was the New Zealand vlog. It was a much longer one, but I did spend 2 months there. It was nice to be in a country for a bit longer. Its culture was quite similar to the UK, but people were sort of nicer. I think that's maybe because it's has a smaller population, so it's like smaller communities and people are nicer to each other. Great for nature. South Island was probably better than the North, I'd say. Less people there, more mountains, and the highlight was probably just being able to go wherever we wanted to in the van and just having loads of picnics outside in the sun, stopping where we wanted, making our own food. So yeah, thanks for watching the vlog. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope people are well. And next one will be South America because we're in Cusco in Peru at the minute. Not that you can see anything, but we've just done Machu Picchu